And the polls will be open in less than 12 hours in Metro Detroit, and there are still many concerns about this year's election. We're seeing a record number of absentee ballots during the COVID-19 pandemic, and there's plenty of rhetoric over whether they will be counted or the validity of some of these ballots. So joining me for tonight's 7 UpFront segment is University of Michigan political science professor Walter Mebane. Thank you for being here with us, Professor.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
All right, first let's talk about the integrity of the voting system. A lot of questions about that, and specifically in our state, and why people should feel secure that their ballot will be counted.
The Secretary of State has described, and others who I've talked to and seen talk about the process, is that they're very well prepared. They in advance prepared for the large increase in absentee votes because of the change in the law that happened in the past year. And so the additional uptick in that due to the virus was a shock, but it wasn't a complete surprise in the sense that they were already getting ready to handle that. The legislative permission for the state and localities to start the processing of those ballots today has put a lot of the pressure off of the counting. So they've announced they will be completed probably by Friday. So those expectations are good there. And the bipartisan way they'll be counted and all that process. So it should go very well by and large throughout the whole state in terms of counting those absentee ballots.
Okay, so possibly counting into Friday. The big question, so many changes this year, are we ready? And are there any concerns we should be worried about?
I think that the election administrators in Michigan are as ready as could be. The one concern has to do with voter intimidation. Online intimidation is something that's happened in 2016 and is happening now, as you mentioned in the lead up to this talk. The loss of the ability to prevent people from bringing guns into or near polling places is a concern, and it could be that that will turn into intimidation or worse. But I think that's the main risk. Long lines should be less of a problem, partly because of the fact that many people voted early and the fact that many polling places apparently have now full staffing. And so that should reduce the possibility for many other adverse things to happen. But I imagine there'll be places where things go wrong as usual. It shouldn't be widespread.
With the increased awareness of intimidation tactics, Professor, do you think that it will work? I mean, do you think voters are falling for it the way they may have in 2016?
It's hard to say. I don't believe, I mean, it's hard to, I don't have any data to know who was deterred from voting in 2016 and to see whether those same voters or could have been voters are now voting. I do know we have very large amounts of turnout. Many people have already voted, as you mentioned, as some 60% of expected voters have already voted. And so many of the people who feared conditions at the polling place have already voted. And so they've managed to avoid that by voting already. I think the passions in this election are pretty intense. So by and large, most people will walk over with the quote, you know, crawl over broken glass to vote. I think they're very enthusiastic supporters for both of the major candidates and parties. So I think by and large, there's not going to be a loss of votes due to that intimidation. The misinformation is another concern, and that's a continuing battle. I think the proportion of people affected by that will be pretty small.
And what is your anticipation, Professor, about how this may play out? I mean, do you see the elections nationally or locally being contested? And what would that mean?
I think if you believe all of the polling information, then the presidential election outcome is probably not going to be close. Probably Biden will win comfortably, but everyone who talks and knows something says don't believe the polls. So it's kind of hard to know whether that will be the case. So there are several scenarios. One is that Joe Biden, the Democrat, wins for president pretty comfortably nationally and early, wins a state like Florida, in which case the wind goes out of the sails of opposition, wins a state like Texas. And so that's one world. Another world is that that doesn't happen and Donald Trump wins those early states and we're into a waiting for Pennsylvania scenario. And then it's kind of hard to know with how many lawsuits will be filed and where they'll be filed and about what. There's been many thousands of lawyers and lawsuits contemplated or filed. So I think it really depends on the magnitude of the information that we have around tomorrow about this time or 3 hours later. whether we're going to have a contested, confusing post-election, or whether it's going to be a relatively early resolve situation with most people pretty sure what the election outcome is.
Well, hats off to all the workers who have made these quick changes and safety and all of those things. Professor Mabin, we thank you so much for joining us tonight with all of your insight on the election. Look forward to talking in the future.
Thank you very much.
Dave.